Well, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for joining us this morning for the launch of the Centre for Brexit Policy's report, Defining Britain's Role in the World After Brexit. I'm delighted to be joined here today by my colleague, the Right Honourable Iain Duncan Smith MP, and the Honourable Alexander Downer AC, who will be speaking to us later on. And we will also hear from Ambassador John Bolton in the United States. This week, of course, marks the 6th anniversary of the EU referendum, when the British people voted to take back control and leave the European Union. It was a momentous day, and one that will shape our nation's future. When Boris Johnson became Prime Minister in July 2019, it was widely assumed that his premiership would be defined by delivering Brexit, thereby grasping the huge opportunities a break with Brussels offered the UK. At that time, no one could have known that just 8 months later, the country would face its greatest challenge since the Second World War in the form of COVID-19. As a consequence, everything, including Brexit, took a secondary role to addressing the pandemic. However, it was more than arguably because of Brexit that the UK had such an early and successful vaccination rollout and vaccine development programme. Indeed, even the Observer's editorial noted that the vaccine crisis has shown the EU at its worst. By contrast, it has shown Britain at its best. While the nation was still feeling the repercussions of COVID, particularly in terms of the economic challenges it presented, the political agenda shifted. The Russian invasion of Ukraine shocked the world, and it's currently impossible to predict how long that atrocity will continue. But again, it was because of our break with the EU that the UK has been able to lead the world in taking decisive action in supporting the heroic efforts of President Zelensky and his people. There are, however, serious concerns that the establishment backlash against Brexit is growing and feeding off the perception that the benefits of Brexit have not yet been delivered. Just last week, Alistair Heath wrote in the Daily Telegraph, "Tony Blair was devastated by the referendum, but he is having the last laugh. We've ended up with a technical Brexit in which Britain is subservient to a permanent left-wing politico-managerial class." This report by the Centre for Brexit Policy, therefore, is timely. It's an important intervention by a team of leading politicians, foreign policy specialists, and academics. It warns that Britain is failing to reap the benefits of Brexit because of the stance of its ruling elites, particularly here in Westminster and Whitehall. The very people who are charged with delivering those benefits are possessed of a defeatist mindset. They believe that the UK is doomed to perpetual decline. But that mindset, declinism, is, as this paper illustrates, nothing more than a post-war myth. On any objective scholarly ranking of its international standing in terms of economic, military and cultural significance, the UK is in the top 6 of world powers, just as it was indeed 300 years ago. In fact, it's placed slightly higher today than it was when King George I was on the throne. But it was because of the declinist mentality that the UK pressed so hard to join the then European Economic Community in the 1970s. And it's because of the persistence of the declinist myth that many in the metropolitan elite continue to scorn Brexit and the electoral majority who voted for it. That must change. And this report provides a pointer to how that may be done. It sets out how the UK, outside the EU, can now forge trade links and alliances across the world, how it can play a dynamic and leading role in helping other democracies stand up to the serious new threats to peace and prosperity posed by China and Russia, and how it can exert its unrivaled soft power in its own national interest and in the interests of the rest of the free world. The report, in short, offers a comprehensive insight into what a post-Brexit British foreign policy really can offer. It assesses, among other things, the importance of the special relationship with the United States and how it can be expanded, how an Anglosphere Plus can act as a counterbalance to Chinese influence, the implications for our relationship with Russia following the Ukraine war, a new framework for European foreign policy, why we must re-engage with Indo-Pacific countries after a period of withdrawal, and how we should capitalize on our relationship with our traditional allies in the Middle East. I'd like to say a huge thank you to all the authors from, indeed, around the world who have spent so much time and effort over the past year helping to produce this important report. And finally, a word of special thanks to Edgar Miller, convener of the Centre for Brexit Policy, for coordinating it. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And ladies and gentlemen, I would now like to introduce our first speaker, who is my colleague, the Right Honourable Sir Iain Duncan Smith, MP. Iain, as you I'm sure know, was elected leader of the Conservative Party in 2001. He set up the Centre for Social Justice in 2003, served as Secretary of State for Work and Pensions until March 2016, where he drove through welfare reform, which resulted in the introduction of universal credit. He played a pivotal role in the successful Leave campaign in 2016 and has continued the fight to deliver a proper Brexit ever since. Ladies and gentlemen, Sir Iain Duncan Smith.
David, thank you very much indeed. I won't keep you too long because you've said it all. I'll just make a few comments on it if you don't mind. One is that I wrote an article today in the Telegraph, and I started with the interesting fact that back in 1973, Sir William Armstrong, then head of the Civil Service, made a very interesting statement which he said to the Civil Service's purpose in life was to manage UK's decline. That literally has flowed through thinking of what I would call the establishment in the UK throughout. It started just after the Second World War, but it has continued, and as he made it clear, it was very much boosted back in the 1970s when it appeared that there was nothing we could do unless, of course, we cleaved to Europe. And that was the biggest mistake we ever made, in the sense that the rule normally is that nations need to heal themselves and resolve their problems, not look to others to do it for them. And that is the sign of a well-run and confident, self-confident nation, and it should start at the top. But the funny thing about the UK, as we found in the run to Brexit, is it started at the bottom and had to work up to the top. The top of the government and of the civil service has been resistant to the idea of an independent United Kingdom in every sense, from economic through to international. And it's interesting that even after Brexit, the paper that was produced, which was about defence, foreign affairs, defence, security, etc., was entitled the role of Britain in a competitive global world. Competitive is interesting, isn't it? Because when they referred to China in that, Russia was a threat, but China was a competitor. I asked, why is China a competitor when they have threatened and taken over landmass already? They've taken over the South China Seas, and they were told by the UN they shouldn't, and they stayed there. They've trashed the Sino-British agreement on Hong Kong, and apart from our complaints, they've continued to lock up peaceful democracy campaigners endlessly. They are committing what I believe to be genocide on the Uyghur in Xinjiang, and interestingly enough, forced slave labour. They are selling products and producing things using slave labour. They put Tibetans into slave labour camps, and they are now cracking down on the outer Mongolians. I mean, what more of a record do you need that they pose a threat to all of their territories around them, and they've even clashed with India on the border again. killing Indian soldiers. So where in what world is China a competitor and Russia a threat? And I got no answer back from the Prime Minister at the time. He just said, well, we've got to be careful. I was told that careful that we don't want to upset China. That is not the attitude of a strong, robust and self-confident nation. That is the attitude of a fearful nation that worries about what others think of you rather than getting them to think the right things. So this paper, I have to say, I welcome enormously. And again, I echo the thanks to Eddie for all the work that he put in to making sure that this paper is here today. But it does talk, and the title is really important. It says, Defining Britain's Post-Brexit Role in the World. It doesn't talk about competition, it talks about us, our role. It talks about who we are historically, what we need to remember about ourselves, and what therefore that says about us as we go forward. Robert Toombs wrote the other day that actually in 300 years, our position in the world hasn't really changed very much. Instead of being a nation in decline, we've been a nation defying all the odds, really, when you think about it. So our ability to influence events continues. We are probably third of the most potent military powers in the world. Our economy itself is still vibrant and capable, even though the Treasury seems determined to destroy that. We have to stop doing that, I have to say, and not for the first time. We talk about the enemy within, but anyway, I won't go there. But the point is that the reality is that learning about who we are, who we were, and what we can do is important. It is important. When you look at, actually, when Ukraine was invaded by Russia, the Prime Minister was able to channel his inner Brexit and make the decision immediately that we would sanction the Russians. He didn't wait for a discussion in the halls in Brussels. He didn't wait to see what the weakest link would decide wasn't possible. He didn't wait to see whether or not on balance we needed to be careful about the oil and gas exports to Germany. He was able to come straight out and say ahead of everybody else, we are now going to impose sanctions on individuals and then bully everybody else to go further. The SWIFT banking system was a very good example. That was mostly led, again, by him. President Biden was a part of that as well. And together they were able to get many of the European nations to face up to facts, which is that you can't go on paying money to Russia whilst condemning them for invading Ukraine. You need to find ways of resolving that. So the paper I recommend to everybody is a paper about who we really are, but who we could really be if we just have that self-confidence in our ruling elites to believe in this country again. It's quite remarkable what this country has given to the rest of the world and remains critical. The English language completely covers the globe. The free market was created here in the UK. The concept of human rights here under common law. Common law itself, which Barney Reynolds has written about endlessly, is a critical component of what we do. It's probably the greatest single legal system that has ever been created in the world, because it is about individuals, about people, and about their innate and natural rights. And every country that wants to move to financial systems doesn't pick, strangely enough, to go to European law, they pick to go to common law, and for that matter, by the way, English common law. They don't get that in any way muddied. So the reality is, almost the effect of the UK historically, which continues to this day, is enormous. And I also say to people, think of a sport. It was made here, really. We may not win any of them anymore, but we certainly did start them, with the exception, I suspect. Well, no, I think even some of the American sports, American football and baseball, were started as different games. But the fact is that the UK, if you think about it, has had an enormous influence and continues to have enormous influence on the rest of the world. And it's not looking back and therefore sitting on our laurels. It's about believing that as the United Kingdom, we are capable of so much, because before us, we have stood on the shoulders of giants, and our chance now post-Brexit is to take advantage of that and to redevelop our links beyond Suez, going back east of Suez, creating alliances again with India. It's very important. All of us in the free world bring India into our support, because India is a huge counterbalance to China, and we must develop it and go on further to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP. We should be members of that. I believe that we should even join the Quad if the Quad would have us. Our connection to east of Suez should be enormous, because we do have to think of the next threat, and this is what I want to end on. The greatest threat we face right now is by a dictatorial and brutal China. Their threats to Taiwan are phenomenal, and we must take them at face value. It is not enough for us to say it's a far and distant land about which we know little. This is a potential ally, and we need to look very carefully at how we can help the rest of the free world protect the independence of Taiwan. It's vital. And China, therefore, must be made clear to them that this is not something that they can take for granted. After Russia invaded Ukraine, we should give up pretending that somehow just the free market brings people to democracy and freedom. It does not. It matters that people can live their lives free of tyranny. And if there's one country here that should remember that, as we sit in these war rooms where we fought for 5 to 6 years to protect the freedoms of many people thousands of miles away, then it is right here. Now this paper tells us why and how, and we should pay attention.
Thank you. Our next speaker is the Honourable Alexander Downer. Alexander was leader of the Australian Liberal Party from 1994 to 1995. He was the longest serving Australian Minister of Foreign Affairs in Australian history from 1996 to 2007. 2008 he became Special Advisor to the UN Secretary General on Cyprus, and he was High Commissioner to the United Kingdom from 2014 to 2018. Alexander Downer.
Well, thanks very much, David. I can say that it's a great pleasure for me to make some remarks to you today in support of this document alongside Iain Duncan Smith. Both of us have a lot in common. We have both been Conservative politicians for a long period of time, but we were both leaders of our party at one stage, leaders of the opposition, with approximately equal degrees of success, I think it's fair to say, in all due modesty. I suppose as a former foreign minister and of quite some long standing, my starting point here is the international system, particularly what you might call the liberal democratic rules-based world order. This was created not just by the Americans, but by the United Kingdom, by Great Britain after the Second World War. And how did it do that? It did that having been with the Americans, two of the major winners, I suppose we'll have to include the Soviet Union, but major winners of the Second World War, and created a new order for the world. That, if I may say so, showed the confidence of Great Britain at that time. Then you go fast forward to 1973, when Britain decided to focus its diplomacy and its economic interests almost entirely on Europe, what became the European Union. I often tell people I was the Foreign Minister of Australia between March 1996 and December 2007, nearly 12 years, and not once in that period did a British Foreign Secretary ever visit Australia. And between 1995 and 2012, 17 years, no British Foreign Secretary visited Australia. And what country in the world has socially more in common than the UK and Australia? I mean, they have so much in common. And the Foreign and Commonwealth Office basically focused on Europe. I'm told that in the last 10 years before the 2016 referendum, 80% of Foreign Office ministerial visits were to European Union countries. So, my starting point was the Great Britain helping to create the modern world and the structure of the modern world. And my next point is after 1973, the country withdrew on itself and into its own region. So it went from being a great global power to being a regional power. And I'd have to say that showed a political class here totally without ambition and without something else, without self-confidence. And what I hope this paper will help to do is to lift this country's self-confidence and particularly get policymakers, members of parliament, even parts of the civil service, God forbid, to become ambitious again for the country and for what the country can do. So we have an international system now which is very challenged, particularly by the quite hostile autocracies of China, obviously Russia, and I would include in that list Iran as well. These countries are hostile not just to us, they're hostile to our system. And what Great Britain should do is contribute wholeheartedly to the upholding and support and evolution of the liberal democratic rules-based order. Why? Not just for its economic interests or because it sounds like a nice thing to do, but in the interests of global peace and global stability. Britain should not be leaving this task to others. Britain should not be taking the view that it's not our responsibility. Our responsibility begins and ends in Europe. It's not our responsibility to worry about the rise of China and the threat of China in the Indo-Pacific region. That's somebody else's business. That was not the tradition of this country, and that should not be the approach of a country which is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, is one of the biggest economies in the world, is a nuclear weapons state, and is a country, I've often argued, that has more soft power than almost any other country in the world through its network of links with countries like my own, like Australia, the United States, Canada, the Anglosphere, and beyond into the countries that were once part of the British Empire. Whatever people here may say about the British Empire, people who were part of the British Empire still very much value their links with Britain. They're not ashamed of their links, and they don't run around as people here do, saying the British Empire was all a horror story, and we have to, start paying out compensation to people for the horrors of what we did. You don't get that attitude outside in Commonwealth countries. So what I would say is that when it comes to the Indo-Pacific region, this is the region of the world which is going to be increasingly the locus of global activities in the years ahead. So whatever we say about Russia and Ukraine, Russia is a weakening power. It's hard to believe that at the moment, but it's definitely true. It is a fading power. China is not. China is a great and rising, and under Xi Jinping, quite a hostile power. And there is an obligation we have to balance China's power, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. You can't just leave that to the Americans, or the Americans, the Japanese and the Australians, and perhaps now increasingly the Indians. Great Britain has to play its part in doing that as well. And this paper very much makes that point. That the UK can get involved in the security architecture of the region through what are called the ASEAN group of institutions, becoming an ASEAN dialogue partner, which the UK has already done, joining the ASEAN Regional Forum, and getting involved in a range of other activities in the region. The UK already has the 5 power defence arrangements with Australia, New Zealand, Singapore and Malaysia, and they have been largely ignored by British governments over the years. It's time the UK started to use that vehicle to insert itself yet again into the security architecture of the Indo-Pacific region. And as Iain says, you could look to a possibility of at some stage the UK joining the Quad with Australia, the United States, Japan and India. Already the UK has the AUKUS agreement, the Australia-UK-US agreement, And I think that's been an important statement by the UK about becoming involved in the region. Finally, as far as the Indo-Pacific region is concerned, I said it's going to become increasingly the locus of global activity in the years ahead. And that does include economic activity. So the UK has put all of its international trade and investment eggs into the EU basket in the past. It's time now to take advantage of that fast-growing part of the world, the Indo-Pacific region. Look to building the trading and investment relationships with India, of course, and the government has been doing that. Joining the comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership of 11 countries in the Asia-Pacific region. Hopefully getting the United States back into that as well at some stage into the future. And looking for the UK to become particularly not just the important financial centre it is, but the financial centre of choice for those for corporates in the Indo-Pacific region, particularly India and other parts of the region. So, look, I've spoken for quite long enough. I finish where I began. Great Britain should not leave the management of the world to others. It should not turn its back on the historic mission it's had of setting up the liberal democratic rules-based international order. It should uphold it. It shouldn't just leave it to the Americans. It should work with the Americans. It should contribute worldwide. And I hope this paper will help to encourage members of Parliament, civil servants, elites, as they like to say, the media, to focus on a bigger role that the UK can have, a bigger vision that it can have, and more self-confidence than it's had in the past. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Our next speaker is on video, and it's Ambassador John Bolton. John Bolton served as US Assistant Attorney General under President Ronald Reagan from 1985 to 1989. He was Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs from 1989 to 1993, Under Secretary of State for Arms Control and International Security Affairs from 2001 to 2005, US Ambassador to the United Nations from 2005 to 2006, and National Security Advisor to President Trump from April 2018 to September 2019. Ambassador Bolton.
Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be with you, even if only remotely, and I wish I were there. But my congratulations to the Center for Brexit Policy on their excellent report and all who worked on it. I think it's extremely important, particularly for a number of areas of great importance to the United States. The first being the report's suggestions for strengthening the special relationship. I think this is a high priority, or should be, for both countries. And I'm particularly glad that one consequence of Brexit is that the United Kingdom can have an appropriate, fully independent role in NATO, not constrained by the decision-making process in the European Union. We can see today all too graphically how important NATO is, with Finland and Sweden breaking decades of neutrality to apply. We need a strong Britain working closely with the United States and NATO. I think there are a number of other places where the special relationship is important. I think given Britain's status as one of the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, I can't think of a more important place in the international forums where we work together. Once again, an independent Britain, not constrained by EU decision making. Certainly, as we look at China through the rest of this century, Britain's status as one of the 5 legitimate nuclear weapon states underlines again the importance of the special relationship as we deal with arms control issues, and the threat of spread of nuclear weapons increases in China, dramatic increases, as well as the risk of nuclear proliferation. And then I think in the broad area of protecting democratic constitutional sovereignty against transnational, multinational threats, including from purported judicial systems around the world. You know, Britain's popular decision through referendum to leave the European Union was a great statement about the importance, really, and the supremacy of constitutional government through the consent of the governed themselves. That's where political legitimacy comes from. And that is a threat I think we're going to see increasingly around the world in the coming years. So the U.S.-UK special relationship has a long history, and I think this post-Brexit report gives us a lot of directions to help improve and strengthen it, which it can use, as I think we all agree. But I also think, looking at the larger world, Britain's role as a global power is incredibly important. Freed of the constraints of the European Union, I think we can see very graphically today, tragically, after the unprovoked Russian invasion of Ukraine, that Britain has taken a leading role in the West's efforts to defeat this aggression and to make the point to would-be aggressors around the world. Yeah, in many respects, I say with some envy, taking a stronger view and more effective view than the United States. But forging our common views on Russia is going to be critical. Even more critical, I think, and again emblematic of global Britain, is how we're going to deal with China, which I take to be the existential threat of the 21st century for the West as a whole. We've already seen significant possibilities in the AUKUS agreement, Australia, the UK, and the US. Potentially a revolutionary paradigm for dealing with external threats around the world. I think we've got to think hard about getting Britain more involved in other emerging institutions. You know, we now have an Asian Quad consisting of India, Japan, Australia, and the United States. It is certainly premature to talk about a Pacific kind of NATO at this point, but I think Britain's role in our common concern about the Chinese threat in the Indo-Pacific warrants an extraordinarily important role. We see right now the threat to Taiwan. Britain fully understands how China breached its obligations under the joint Sino-British declaration on the handover of Hong Kong. There's an awful lot of work to do. A post-Brexit Britain is primed to do it. I think the report is an excellent declaration about Britain as a global power, and I tell you, the overwhelming majority of Americans welcome it. So thanks for the chance to participate here today, and good luck in the years ahead.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, if there are any questions, I'm sure that both Iain and Alexander would be delighted to answer them. Unfortunately, John Bolton can't. But we also have a number of contributors to this report in the room today, and if there are any particularly technical googlies that anybody wants to bowl, I'm sure they'll be able to field them. So when you ask a question, you can identify yourself and say who the question in particular is addressed to. Who'd like to go first? Gentleman over there.
Hi, Jack Elson from the Sun newspaper. Can I address a question to both of the ex-ministers and Tory MPs in the panel? Obviously, the tax burden is at the highest it's been since the post-war. To what extent does making a success of Brexit and Britain an attractive place to be hinge on cutting taxes? How do you think that's viewed in Downing Street, given they are raising taxes? And then Iain, you joked about the sort of enemy within. How damaging is it that parts of your own party, parts of the civil service are clearly not on board with Brexit? It doesn't make it a success.
Iain, do you want to go first?
It is not.
The other one is.
Try the other.
Try the other one.
Right, okay. I'm not sure we really need this anyway. But two things very quickly. My apologies because I'm going to have to leave in 10 minutes. I have to chair a board meeting of the Centre for Social Justice, which I set up, and I've also got another meeting called the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, which we also set up. So to address the question, I think economically, and you've got Patrick in the room here, Patrick Minford, so he can probably explain this in far better detail than I can. I think the problem we face right now is a misunderstanding of what the issue really is. Of course, inflation is a significant problem, most of it caused by external shocks. A chunk of it caused by the bank's failure to recognise what was going on at least a year ago and to have stopped printing money. So that bit is the domestic end of it. Of course, we need to bring that under control, categorically, there's no question about that. The question then is, do we bring that under control in a way that kills the economy, or do we bring inflation under control whilst keeping the economy growing? And it's critical that we keep the economy growing at the same time as we deal with inflation. So the bank is belatedly putting up interest rates. Debate about whether they should have done it more a couple of days ago, a few days ago, but that on one side, you know, interest rates towards that. The key thing here is taxes are too high in the UK right now, and they need to come down. They need to come down because people are really feeling the pain, and that would release more money into the economy to keep the economy going. I don't think these will drive inflationary pressures. A lot of economists, from Patrick through to Jared Lyons, all of them will say that it's possible to do two things at the same time. And the key thing is to get that economy moving by keeping taxes low, particularly on the squeezed middle who are suffering. And also, by the way, when a government intervenes, and the government's done a lot of intervening in the recent months, well, recent years, but particularly in the last few months since the spring statement, the trouble is they fritter it away into different areas, none of which are identified directly with government intervention, nor do they have a lasting effect. So the key thing is here, government should act boldly, it should focus its act on taxation, and it should be driving it down. And if you think of corporation tax, somebody said it was going up by 5%. Well, first of all, that's wrong, but it was due to come down by 2%, so it was a net 7% move from what was forecast. We need to get that down to make sure investment in the UK takes place. So number one, Treasury, I think, has got it wrong, and they need now to make sure the economy grows, and we need to do that by getting taxes down to a level that people can afford, puts money back into the economy. It's very clear, I think, and simple. And with regards to different views on Brexit, there will always be different views on Brexit. Lots of people I know, who I consider friends, didn't want to have Brexit, but it's quite interesting. When I did a recent report on a regulation called the Tigger Report, which, by the way, I recommend everybody reads, because it talks about moving from our regulation system from a coded system to a system of common law where you assume things are okay until it is demonstrable that they are not. You don't try and figure out what it's going to be like in 10 years' time and then legislate for that. But importantly, there was a group of scientists that came to see us about it. Every one of them had voted to remain. But they came to see us and said, now that we've gone, given what we did on the vaccines and the skills and expertise that exist in the UK, they're very keen for us now to make sure the regulations are set in place to ensure that the medical tech industry centres itself here in the UK. And they were quite clear about this. They want us, now we're out of the EU, to develop a British policy for regulation that attracts people over here, after all, with anonymised data from the biggest source of data on health in the world, which is the NHS. This is a phenomenal potential. These were people who voted Remain, but they recognise now the potential of creating a market which would be even bigger than financial services here in the UK. So there's just a good example of lots of people understand that whether we liked it or not, having gone, we need to take advantage of the potential things that we can. And I think that's important, and that's what this paper is all about.
The question was addressed to both of us. I don't think I can add much to that comprehensive reply. Safe to say that I remember that it was Philip Hammond, of all people, who said that post-Brexit, the UK, London in particular, could become Singapore on Thames. You will not get Singapore on Thames if you have higher rates of taxation than your competitors. So Iain's absolutely right. We should be looking aggressively at taxation to encouraging good investment in this country.
I just wanted to add one comment, having been part of the Australian government for many years. I do find here the government, and I can, because these two are MPs, I'm not, I do find that the government has a lack of focus on what it wants to achieve in economic policy. So they don't talk about it and articulate it clearly. Clearly what they need to do above all is encourage investment into the UK. Because if you get investment, you get improvements in productivity, you create jobs and you create wealth. Without investment, you're not going to do that. Why on earth, post-Brexit, would the British government have said they're going to increase the company tax rate? I just cannot understand. I can understand that it's easy to talk about tax cuts when you have spent so much money that it's contributed to inflation. I can understand why the Treasury would be loath to spend even more and run up even more debt. But I cannot understand why post-Brexit the British government has proposed to increase company tax rates. I think it is completely foolish. And I do very much hope, since you're both MPs, you'll try to do something about that to ensure that the 19% company tax rate was a very, very good idea. 17.
No, it was going to come down to 17.
I mean, you know, it's been the secret of success of a number of economies that they have low company tax rates. And now you're putting it up. The Conservative Party is putting it up post-Brexit. I find that incomprehensible.
Thank you. Any further questions? Complete satisfaction.
I'll ask one. Having contributed to this report, I do notice that how do we change the civil service? I think that when I first arrived in Britain 30 years ago, I knew several friends in the city whose parents were senior civil servants, and that was considered to be a really good thing to be. It was in that era, I suppose, after the Second World War, when they did the thinking of what country can do for you, but what you can do for your country attitude, and yet the next generation all went straight to the city and we made loads of money, and that was great for us. But consequently, the people running the civil servants, I don't think are the smartest bunch. There are, I'm sure, there are some individuals, but I don't think, just because of the way we compensate people, I don't think that it attracts the people with imagination or guile or, even willing to Google things, so, I'm not joking, I deal with some of them, and you sit there thinking, how do we change that mentality?
Iain's poised on his microphone.
Yeah, I was going to answer that. Can I just, before I start, I really should have mentioned Bill sitting here, Bill Cash, who is the father of Brexit, I have to tell you, without whom none of us would be sitting here, so it's a real pleasure to have you, Bill, as well at the time. On the civil service, there's an element of truth, which is the competition of the private sector would tend to pull some of the brightest and best out of universities to go into other jobs. But that's not wholly the truth, because when I was Secretary of State for Work and Pensions, there were a lot of really good people in the civil service who joined because they liked the whole idea of being involved in government policy. When I came forward with a whole series of very radical reforms, what I found was that if you have a very clear idea of where you're going, if you show leadership in wanting to be there, then they will be led. Like any other organisation, if you don't have a clear vision of what you want to do, then what they do is fill in the spaces for you. And of course, every organisation is guilty of groupthink, where you sort of settle down to the lowest common denominator because it's easy, it doesn't trouble you during the day, and you're not going to get criticised for it. But the truth is, even now in the civil service, there are frustrated people who want to do something but are held back. So changing the civil service to look very carefully at a whole variety of things, such as allowing civil servants who have particular skills. Let's say one of the biggest problems in the civil service right now is managing big programs. Now, when I came in to do UC, they put somebody onto it who had managed a program a while back which nobody could remember, etc., and then they took it over. This was a complex program involving huge digital change, and they got lost. I had to put in another team to look at it, to see what had gone wrong and stop it, set it again. And we brought somebody in from outside. What they did was taught somebody else in the civil service how to run a program and then actually manage the Olympic Park. That individual today, after 7 years, is still running Universal Credit. And the point is, I would describe that individual as a bit of a cowboy. In other words, he broke lots of rules to get things done. And there are people like that in the civil service. So I found, once you have a clear vision, once you want and you know where you're going, those civil servants that really came in to do something will gravitate to you very fast because they want to be identified with success and with risk. Risk is important to them. Right now they try and modify that down. So you're right, the civil service needs to change, but it needs to change rather like the private sector has changed, which is reward people who are really good and get rid of the dead men's shoes process, which goes on in civil service, where the only thing that marks you out as successful is you become a permanent secretary. But if you are a program manager that's brilliant, you should be rewarded way past a permanent secretary because the whole of government relies on the delivery of that program, in which case allow them to go into the private sector to run programs and come back into the civil service to do it. That way you'll cover over that point of some people going off to the private sector and some people in civil service. But the truth is, the one single word I would say is leadership. If you lead and are clear about where you are going, you'll be astonished. It's the same in the army, it's the same in the private sector, and it's absolutely the same in the civil service. If ministers know what they're doing and lead, you will find you can achieve your objectives because the really good people will want to come and work for you because they know they have a real chance of scarring their names across the firmament of success, and that's the important picture. Get lost, nobody wants to work.
I'm glad to see that Bill Cash wants to contribute at this stage, and before I invite him to speak, can I also commend him for his clarity of vision and his firmness of purpose over such a long time. Frankly, ladies and gentlemen, were it not for Bill Cash, I don't think we'd have achieved Brexit.
I'll give you that one.
I wanted to say how welcome this is, and I want to pay tribute to Ed and to all the contributors because it's such an important and Rob Toots here. I had a nice chat with him just now. I really think it's terribly important for us to understand that the defeatism that accompanied the situation in the post-war period is also part of this trouble that we've got with the civil service as well. And when I had a big argument with the civil service in number 10 in October 2019, I went in there because I thought we ought to put down an amendment which I drafted about 4 in the morning after Boris had signed the withdrawal agreement, insisting on British sovereignty. I won't go into the details, but basically to give the override capacity for the British Parliament to be able to bypass the Northern Ireland Protocol and also the withdrawal agreement. When I was in the meetings with these people, and there were cabinet ministers there, and I was on my own, I was having a great time actually, and Boris and senior civil servants. Barney came in at the late part of the evening actually, about 9:30 or something. I was in there for 8 hours. It was a fantastically exciting experience. But actually, Boris agreed to it. And I want to make this point. Boris, for all the criticism that he gets, most of which I believe to be completely unjustified in so many respects, actually sees the big picture. And when we're talking about leadership, to get this sort of argument completely right, which he has over Brexit, and which this paper endorses, because we now have an opportunity to be able to build on all the things that Alexander has said, which Iain has said, what David has said, what the contributors of this paper have said. I just want to reflect slightly on this, the origins of all this, because when the White Paper, and I just mentioned this in conclusion, when the White Paper was being put together in 1970-71, it's really worth looking at the archives in Kew to see what the civil servants were actually saying. I did actually make a contribution along these lines in a previous Brexit Centre for Brexit policy paper, but read it because it tells you what the civil servants were really thinking and what they were advising and how negative it all was and how they really didn't think there was any future for the United Kingdom other than to be in the European Union. And the whole of the legal apparatus of the government legal service has been incredibly obstructive all the way through this. Time and time again we put down amendments. For example, the Rwanda, the Board's Nationality Bill. I put down the amendment which David Jones, Iain, Duncan Smith and many others supporting. We got about 60 or 70 people to sign it. But would they listen? No. They wanted to kill it off because we were talking about leaving the European Convention on Human Rights and the Human Rights Act. The reality is that you can't change the attitudes if you don't change the law. So you have to change the law, and Barney has played a very big part in helping to contribute to all that. The negativity of the government's legal service is based on a simple proposition which I put to them in number 10 in October 2019. I said the trouble is that none of you have ever actually practiced any law other than under the aegis of the European Union, because they're all post-1973 lawyers. That's a real problem. But I could go on at great length and I won't say any more. But I really want to congratulate everybody on this paper, the breadth of it, the depth of it, and also the optimism that lies behind it. That's the key. But in addition to that, just simply to say, we're on the right track. Brexit works. We're going to fight these Remainers, the Reversers, and the Revengers, the 3 R's I call them. And they are the 3 who are going to be defeated, because we not only won it, we won it with the democratic consent of the British people, we won it with a general election, and I think it's the best thing that's happened to this country for hundreds of years. Thank you very much.
And ladies and gentlemen, on that optimistic and positive note, can I draw this meeting to a conclusion? Thank you so much for coming here. Thank you so much for managing to get here in the first place. But thank you so much for being here, and I hope you have a safe journey home. Thank you.
Thank you.